Welcome to Tabletop Tommies. I'm Jonny.
And I'm Phil.
And it's a very exciting episode. Finally, we can talk about V3, which we have in hand. Got my copy here. You got your copy there, Phil?
I've got my copy here, yeah.
Fantastic. First, we're going to talk about the Welsh Open, which we've just been to, which I thought was a great opportunity to sort of look back on V2, having played V3, and it really highlighted the differences more than just playing V3 did for me. But then we're going to talk about all the good stuff that's changed in V3 and our opinions of it.
I don't know about you, Jonny, but I found for my first probably 20 minutes or so of my first game at the weekend that I was in V3 mode and I couldn't get my head around to hit modifiers. And I said to my opponent, Martin, I'm really sorry. I've been playing V3 for the last few weeks and, bear with me kind of thing. Obviously, it's like muscle memory and it came back pretty quickly. But that first 20 minutes or so, I was like, yeah, okay, I've got to do small team and cover and all this kind of stuff just to hit. So
yeah, and for me, it was more the things that the tactics you're playing where, I wish I had that extra officer. I wish the officer had the V3 rules or the spotters had the V3 rules. On this occasion, I've played that completely wrong for V2. There was a couple of games that were just an absolute wash for me. But overall, did you enjoy the Welsh Open?
Yeah, I really enjoyed the Welsh Open. So it's my third time of going. We've had Mark on the pod before, Mark Latio. It's always a great weekend. It's at Firestorm, and we talked about Firestorm games a lot. So great venue, great TO, and just a lovely atmosphere. Great bunch of players as well. Some new faces and some old familiar faces too. So yeah, overall, really nice weekend and a nice end to V2 for me. That is the last game of V2. There's nothing scheduled, nothing coming up. So it will be full on moving over to V3 from now on properly.
Yeah, absolutely. It might not be the last V2 tournament ever, but for me, it is my last V2 tournament, probably my last V2 game, as you say. Mm-hmm. And it was the Welsh Open was, as ever, just one of the best tournaments in terms of the way it's ran, the venue, the opponents. There was just a really good vibe in the whole building the whole weekend. And we had a special visit in, didn't we, from one of the Wargaming magazines who commented on that.
Yeah, Wargames Soldiers and Strategy was there on Saturday, so taking photos. If you jump over to their Facebook page, there's a lot of really nice pictures of the models that people were using and the tables, and some nice posts as well about the atmosphere and the attitude from the players.
Yeah, and it was brilliant. I really hope it continues into V3 because it is one of the best tournaments, especially if you are a player who hasn't been to a tournament before. I'd say the Welsh Open is probably the one I'd recommend as your first tournament because it is just players playing in the best spirits and also bringing really interesting thematic lists. Like that UN list was pretty cool, wasn't it?
So if you're not on Facebook or you haven't looked at the Bolt Action group on Facebook recently, do have a look. Mark's put up pictures from the event. So David from the Pegasus group in Aldershot, Pegasus Warlords group, he had a really unique early war British force, which was basically a what if force. It was essentially what if the UN was formed after World War One, and that clearly was the runaway winner in terms of best themed and best painted. It looks awesome. The vehicles look amazing. The Scottish on the camels look amazing as well. So yeah, it's a great little force, and that's sort of typical of the Welsh Open. People use it as an opportunity to take different lists or different nations they don't normally play, and build towards it as well. Speaking of which, Jonny, what did you take, and how long did you take building your list for it?
Well, I felt somewhat shamed by Mark on Facebook there because he called me out personally, expecting me to miss the list deadline. So I sent it in very early. It was in at least 20 minutes before the deadline, as an absolute minimum. Yeah. And I genuinely, the reason I actually left it at the last minute, it was partly because there was a lot of V3 stuff going on and live stuff going on. And partly I just didn't really know what to take. Usually when I'm going to tournaments, I'm trying out, especially like the Welsh Open, I'll try out a quirky unit that you never really see because there's a chance that it has a really useful little niche for it in the competitive scene. But obviously there's no need for that now because it was just a bit of a V2 blowout. And so I took a bit of a weird, so I submitted the list. And then when I went to put it in the case, I was very surprised by the things I'd included in it. And so it was like the greatest hits basically of my time playing Bolt Action. So I threw in the Satan, which is one of the earliest tanks that I converted. because I love flamethrowers. I converted early on. I found it to be not that great, and people don't really like facing it because it's a flamethrower. So it doesn't really get much table time. So I thought one final blowout, because it's cheaper than the 105 as well, which was my other choice. I had a buffalo, and then I didn't want loads of dice because I wanted to really enjoy the weekend and not and like have plenty of time playing my games and socializing. So all those vets, I ended up with about 12 dice. I even took a veteran bazooka and a dodge, but it was I had enough transports that I could put all the men in the buffalo. I had the heavy mortar in a dodge, and then I'd taken a medium artillery piece as well, a howitzer, which I never usually take, but I'd taken the tractor for him. So in my first game, I entered the table fully tracked. Everything just came on in a transport, which was a lot of fun, to be honest. It was a nice way to sort of end V2. And what about you? What did you bring?
So I took a Japanese list. I took the Invasion of Manchuria selector from the armies of Japan. So this is the 1931-1932 selector, because I wanted to run Japanese cavalry. Which, when I submitted the list, I didn't actually own. So I put the list in about, I think it was like 3 weeks before the deadline, and then I had to kitbash 16 cavalrymen. So I used the Perry ACW horses and the bottoms, cut them off at the waist, and then cut the Japanese bodies off at the waist, stuck them together, did some green stuff, and pulled it off. So yeah, it was a very early war, pre sort of 1939 Japanese list. So two cavalry squads, three big squads of regulars, an engineer squad in the truck. Had the Type 92 tankette, which I absolutely love, which has got even better in V3. And I had the Hargo as well. So both my vehicles were Armour 7, and I wasn't expecting a lot from them over the weekend, but I think I lost one in 2 games. So I think over 10 possible kills, I think I only lost 2 out of 10. So that was pretty good going
Nice.
for two Armour 7 vehicles. It was only 14 dice. You can't take snipers in that selector. You can't take the anti-tank guys as well. So my anti-tank was basically a Hargo, an HMG. I had obviously the engineers in a truck and a medium howitzer. And then I had a couple of mortars backing it up. So it was, yeah, it was. I didn't think it was a very good list, if I'm honest. I played one warm-up game, which did go well, but that's because my opponent had a KV2. So like he sunk however many points into his KV2, which I promptly ignored and then dealt with the rest of his army. But I thought if I come up against any armor over the weekend, I'm going to struggle. So
Yeah.
yeah.
I had a similar experience with only the bazooka, really, and a couple of HMGs. And then I was relying on the flamethrowers, which obviously are not a reliable way to take out a tank generally, unless you can really distract them with everything else in your force. And I had the opposite I played a Panther in my last game, and I hadn't done the Panzernacker tertiary, where you had to destroy a tank with an infantry carried anti-tank weapon, and I was determined for the bazooka to kill this Panther, and I just couldn't do it. And I lost the game.
Focused on the Panther, but didn't work. So
Yeah, I both lost the game and failed the tertiary. So it
yeah.
was, but it was a lot of fun still, racing forward, especially when the bazooka just wouldn't die in reply.
Mhm.
Uh, but but anyway, how did you do overall?
So overall, I won 4 and lost 1. So I had five great games. 4 opponents I played previously and 1 new to me. So my first game was against Martin Knowles. He had a really interesting US Army battling Bastards of Bataan list, which is from the sort of end of 1941 to early 42. So he had Philippine scouts. So we had a bit of a cavalry off in that game. Jay Taylor, who I hadn't played before, in the second game had a US Marines list. And then Ian Gilmore, I played in the third game with British. I think it was British Sicily or British Eighth Army Italy list. So I won all 3 games on day 1, and I went into day 2. So day 1 was random pairings. It was a jump to the left system, and then day 2 was Swiss. So I was second placed Axis on going into day 2. And I played David, who I've played at the last 2 Welsh Opens. He had a really tasty Polish Lancer list. So we had a cavalry off. So I won that one. So I went into the final game as the top Axis playing against Rich H. who had the Soviet tractor factory list with just an absolute ton of inexperienced blobs, two T-34s, a couple of howitzers and autocannons, and it was a really open table. So I struggled in that game, so I lost that one. But I finished third Axis overall, so really happy with that.
Nice, well done.
Yeah, thank you.
It's a good
Uh,
finish.
yeah, no, I was pleased with it. As I said, I guess I got away with it a little bit because I didn't come up against a huge amount of armor. So when I did, I either ignored it, or in the case of against Rich, I maybe focused on the armor too much, but then wasn't able to actually deal with his other units. But yeah, 4 wins. Yeah, very happy with that third place Axis overall. What's interesting actually is if you look at the overall scores for the Allied and Axis, how low the Axis scores were. So, like, I think it put me something like 14th or 15th overall, but despite being third best Axis, so it did show that the Allies did really well over the weekend.
Yeah. How many points did you get? Do you know?
I want to say 72.
All right.
72 with a low dice lost. So I was pretty good at preserving my forces. Yeah. And yourself, Johnny, how did you get on?
Well, I was aiming for about 70 points, and I got 70 points. I went into the last game on 66, and so I was just basically playing for the secondary to get myself over the line on the 70. For me, the big highlight for me was playing all the different lists. So in my first game, I played Keith of the Welsh Warlords, and he had 2 Stugs, and Mark had kindly put me on one of the only tables where there was water, so the buffalo could shine. I actually didn't use the buffalo because it was one of those classic D-Day tables where there's sort of like a beach on one flank. And I didn't put the buffalo in the water because there was zero cover. So obviously the Stugs could just roll on and hit it. But he'd put the secondary objective in a little boat in the sea. And some officer did run down the jetty and jump in the boat, which was a lot of fun. And then my second game, I'd played Josh of the organizer for Frozen and the Chosen. And he was running a really interesting sort of Italian list with like a heavy howitzer that he just really intimidated us with. And he ran like lots of shirkers. Lost that one, but it was a really fun game because it was sort of like 2 quirky lists facing off in a sort of quirky mission where the objectives were diagonal, and we just sort of threw our armies at each other basically to see what would stick. And then the buffalo just lost its morale at one point and kept reversing, and then obviously the engineers are then trapped on my back line more than 6 inches from anything useful. So I lost that one. And then in my third game, I played my first James of the weekend, James J. And he was running Japanese. That was a really tough list. But we played one of the ones where it was, what was it called? Where you set up in the middle.
Hedgehog,
that's what it was called. So I wasn't allowed to be within 18 inches of my table edge and 15 inches from any of the others. It was a really interesting dynamic where my original plan was going to be to stand on his table edge, basically 15 inches away, and just go in an ambush. And then I saw his Japanese list and did the exact opposite.
Because he had 2 of the engineering vehicles, didn't he? So
he did, yeah.
Yeah. You'd have had two flamethrower vehicles in your face pretty early on if you tried that. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. And I was really fortunate in that he split them on opposite flanks, and then the one that was on the flank with my Satan ran out of fuel after its first activation. And so I got really lucky that the Satan could then come around and show him how it was done and take it out. But then obviously the Satan then ran out of fuel the following turn, basically. So it didn't make that much of a difference. But I think if they'd been paired, I would have been in real trouble. But yeah, so I managed to squeak a win out of that one. And then in my fourth game, I was playing Phil Parker, who is a bit of a tournament regular, team at most of the tournaments. And he was running a really interesting German armoured list. So he didn't have much infantry, but he had like a Panzer, a recce vehicle, and one of the half tracks with an autocannon on the back, as well as running an 88, which was intimidating. But I managed to, because I had the mortar and the howitzer, I managed to get the 6 before he did. And so luckily dealt with that and got the tertiary for indirecting an artillery piece. And then my final game was against my second James S. And he was the one who ran a Panther. Lots of shirkers in his list. It was like a late war, sort of like Hitler Youth, all the sort of like last levy defense of Berlin kind of list. He had the classic sort of fuel shortage Panther. And so the first turn he ran at 18 inches because if it's going to run out of fuel, it should at least be halfway up the table.
Of course, yeah.
And so that one, second water of the weekend actually as well, and I was determined to drive the buffalo across the water. Outflanked it onto the side of the river, and then he knocked it out with his armored car just before I got to the river. So my buffalo actually never saw any water all weekend, which was probably my biggest failure of the whole weekend. But I got the secondary, and as I say, it got me to 70 points. And so I was pretty happy overall. Can't argue with that result. I think it was 3 wins, 2 losses. Tertiaries most games, secondary most games. Fairly happy overall.
Sounds good. Yeah, I made lots of clippity-cloppity noises all weekend as I moved my cavalry around, which was awesome. And they, if I say so myself, they look cool. Just having a line of cavalry, you know, with the flag on one of them, just charging across. Yeah, it was cool. It was just really good fun, and all my opponents were great. And you know, the games that you know, that I won were not necessarily, you know, runaways at all. The game against David was an absolute nail biter in that 4th round. But they're all played in absolutely brilliant spirits. So.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It really was a good vibe all weekend. And well done to Rich Humble for winning. Won his own trophy back.
He did, yeah. Rich made all the trophies again. If you have a look on Facebook, you can see them. And then got to take one home with him. Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. So, I mean, if I may segue. Cavalry is incredibly cool, and I think even in V3, it's taken a bit of a hit, but because of that rule of cool, I think we are going to see some. So shall we use that as a way to just take a step sideways and jump into our V3 rules?
Absolutely, yeah. And just before we get stuck into it, just firstly to say a big thank you to Warlord Games. They sent us the PDF, and we've both managed to play quite a few games as well. And also a big thank you to Osprey Games, who sent us the hard copy in the last week. So we've been kind of working off the PDF for a while now, but also having that copy in your hand is great. And I do just want to say that the book looks awesome. When you have the book in your hand, it is a properly impressive piece of work. There's a lot more introduction in the sense of the history of the war and the different theatres. The illustrations, like you'd expect from Osprey, are brilliant. It feels great. The index, people have talked about the index already on different podcasts. Marcus has made a big thing about it, and it is great to have an index. But it's a big, you know, it's a big old substantial thing, you know, and it's a nice book. It's not just a collection of rules, if that makes sense. So yeah, the quality of the book and the production is cool. Actually having that copy from Osprey and being able to you know, hold it in your hand and all that, there is something about obviously just reading a physical version rather than looking at a PDF and flicking through on your phone or your computer. So yeah, big thank you to Warlord for sending us the PDF, and big thank you to Osprey for the physical version.
Absolutely, yeah. Huge thank you from me as well. And I do want to echo your points that I'm loving the maps in the front. I haven't really dived into them yet to sort of really examine the detail on them, but just flicking through the book and seeing the maps really pulls you into the book straight away. I would like more sort of Dad's Army style arrows on the maps, maybe, just to help me follow the action as we go through the war. But as maps go, they're looking pretty good. My thoughts on the index, before we even jump into the rules, it is phenomenal having an index compared to V2 no index.
Yeah.
But I have noticed already in the playtest that they've done that thing, you know, if you've got sort of an encyclopedia or something, you might look up a word and it'll give you a few pages that it's referenced on.
Yeah.
I've noticed that they haven't done that yet. So there is some room for improvement there. Because there's a few rules that are still sort of in 2 places because they apply in 2 places. But generally what I've found is 95% to sort of 98% of the time, I turn to the index and the rule is exactly where it says it is.
Yeah. That's interesting because I've been playing Old World for a while now, and the Old World index is pretty substantial to the point where there's like 2 or 3 page numbers that are referenced, and you turn to one and it says, and literally the entry will say, please see page whatever. So you turn to that page just to be directed to another page, which is really frustrating. So I haven't found that yet in the bolt action rulebook, where generally speaking, if the page number's in the index, that is where you need to look. But there might be, like you say, somewhere else.
Well, if I can give you an example, actually, one of the examples that I found was the infiltrators rule. So the infiltrators rule directs you to the special rule for infiltrators. But if you want to know about the setup conditions, you need to find that page yourself, basically, because it's in the
how to play a game, how to organise in a game of bolt action. Yeah,
and so that was a bit when I first got the book and I was trying to see how that played. That did take me much longer than I expected having the index, but obviously now I know where it is.
Yeah.
it's not a huge problem. but but that's the one that springs straight to mind. I think there was a couple others, but nothing as noteworthy as that one.
Yeah.
Should we jump into some other changes?
Yeah, I mean, go for it. Like, I'm not proposing that we kind of go through every single change because A will probably miss some, and B will be here for ages. But we've deliberately sat on it for a while in order to kind of absorb it, read the rules, think about it, play some games, reflect on them, and so on. So, yeah, I'll kick us off. I want to talk about HQ. I want to talk about
Good.
commanders
It's a
and
good place to
HQ.
start. I'm
Yeah,
happy to start there. Yeah.
start with the guys at the front.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, now you've got platoon commanders and company commanders. We haven't got the first and second lieutenant and captain and major distinction,
Or
and
lieutenant if you're American.
or lieutenant if you're American, or whatever the non-English versions are. So as a bit of a kind of caveat, in the games that I've been playing, I haven't been building like really strong, lists, trying to kind of like min max and so on. I've been, if I'm taking a bunch of regulars, my commander is a regular, for example. And the reason I'm saying that is that my experience so far is that the days of seeing the officer as a tax and taking an inexperienced officer because you have to, I don't think in the long term we're going to see that play out with V3 because officers are so important now. Pins are so easy to come by. And therefore your pins will stack up quickly with regards to your morale, which has a massive impact on your order check. However, because your basic platoon commander is giving you a +2 to that order check, or +4 if it's a company commander, you can afford to almost ignore three pins, maybe even 4 pins. The number of times I've had a regular unit with 3 pins, they're testing on 9 down to 6, but the officer's within 6 inches, and they're testing on an 8, and they've passed. That's been quite significant in my games. If I'm running a solo, inexperienced officer who, is going to die on a 3, they're not going to last very long, and I'm very quickly going to find that the buff that my officers are giving me is going to be lost to me if I'm only running a single guy, inexperienced, and seeing it as attack. So, certainly there's been big changes to the officers. The other big change,
I think there probably is still a place for inexperienced officers.
Mm-hmm.
Like there will be certain niches where the inexperienced officer sits, but I am in agreement that now officers are so cheap. It's basically you buy 3 men, you pay 20 points upgrade, and you get to boost everything within 6. The snap 2s are so good now that everyone gets 2 snap 2s.
Yeah.
I found myself using that just relentlessly, and it just nicely speeds up the turn. It gets sort of stuff moving on the go, puts 2 pins out at a time, because now you need to put out multiple pins very quickly, because otherwise people, as you say, you just ignore them because there's so many officers about now. Because if you're building your sort of generic reinforced platoon from V2, you need at least 4 or 5 officers, and so that's so plentiful that you do need to just, if you're trying to pin people down, you've got to really throw pins at them. And so, but because it's so cheap and because inexperience is one of the very few to hit modifiers, I think that jump from inexperienced to regular it's worth the points more than ever now. And they're so cheap now. So 30 points for an officer is incredible because you're basically getting a first lieutenant as well for that.
It's 21 points for an inexperienced officer or 30 for a regular. 9 points is not a huge amount, particularly given that some of the things like SMGs and assault rifles and so on have gone up in price, and Panzerfaust, etc. So you can find 9 points, to be fair. Probably during the list building. So HQs have changed, and that's in the context of pins and keeping the army moving. Something I found is that because you've got 2, 3, maybe even 4 officers around. Something I've been doing a lot, which has worked really well, is having a couple of squads with an officer and kind of treating it as three dice together, moving together and working out the board together, in order to keep things moving. I guess if we're talking about pins, let's talk about shooting, because it's a natural segue there.
I mean, before we do, I would like to take a stop at Rally.
Okay.
Because it's a very, very short update, and it kind of ties in nicely, because Rally now just removes all your pins immediately, which I think is such a nice change, because there's many times I've taken that tactical rally and lost 2 pins on a 6-pin unit, and it's just been really frustrating. And so just from a sort of speeding the game up, making Rally really tempting, I think that's really good.
And the same with staying down in carrying a down order from one turn into the next.
Took the words out of my mouth. The one thing I thought with that, though, because I do quite like that, but my only thought with that from a games mechanic is it does devalue what I've just said about rally, because I liked the V2 like tactical decision of at which point in the turn do you rally. So you're on that objective, and you do want to keep the squad alive, so you want to keep them the opportunity to go down, but you know you need to get rid of the pins. And so I liked having to make that decision of when in the turn you rally to keep them alive, but also you can't be pinned out. And now just keeping them down means they're going to be very hard to shift off objectives because people don't have to rally anymore. And so I'm actually on the fence about that down change. I think I might have been tempted to keep it either the same or make it D6.
I guess it depends where that unit is on the board when you decide to keep them down. And the reason I'm saying that is even though you've got a load of officers flying around, units are dying more easily in V3. I've certainly found that I've got towards turn 4, turn 5, turn 6, and I've lost maybe 4 or 5 dice because I've stepped out into cover and just got obliterated. Or what is left is not great at actually doing a lot. If I've got 2 or 3 officers left, but I've lost a couple of squads, especially if I've only taken 1 rifle platoon, so I've only got 4 squads anyway, and I've lost a couple of squads. That's half my infantry are gone. So um, yes, the down will clear the pins, but actually you might need that unit to do something because it's one of your remaining squads, and you don't want to have another turn where that squad's not doing anything. So.
Yeah, it's for me the jump moving into the shooting, the cover saves now, and being down in hard cover, getting that 2+ save. You're very hard to shift unless the person's got something particular like flamethrowers or high explosive indirect. And so this is where if the person can just go down constantly and lose all their pins every turn, I would have liked to have kept down how it was to force people to have to stay up sometimes, otherwise risking being pinned out. Because it is, if someone manages to take out your high explosive and your flamethrowers and anything that's sort of effective at point blank, it's very hard to shift those units on objectives now. If the objective's in a dense sort of hard cover,
it is. And when we talk about assaults, I'll come back to that point. Spoiler alert.
Was there more to discuss in shooting?
Yeah, well, the cover save. So when it was first announced that there was going to be cover saves, I did. I just questioned when it was said that it wasn't adding anything to the game time, because I was like, well, you're adding another dice roll. You roll, to hit, to wound, and to save. And having played, say 5 or 6 games, it plays really quickly because you're not doing the mental maths. When you roll to hit, effectively, it's have I moved? Am I inexperienced? Maybe am I a team weapon who's lost the assistant, etc. So there's really not a huge number of modifiers now. So it's pretty straightforward in terms of rolling to hit. And also because you're making your own cover saves when you're shot at, you are staying engaged in the game slightly more than you were before. To be fair, you were engaged anyway because of the random activation, because of the order dice. But I haven't found that cover saves have made a big difference at all in terms of the speed of the game.
Yeah, no, absolutely. On that note, one of the things that I noticed playing was, so even in the very first game I think I played, towards the end of the game I realized I'd very rarely actually measured any shooting, because the only time I'm measuring shooting is if I'm potentially point blank or if I'm potentially out of range. But most of the time, I know that I'm in range, and so I'm just going to shoot, and so that saved quite a bit of time not having to measure the half range.
That's a really good point, and unless you're maybe firing, indirect, am I within the minimum range? Or if I'm firing, anti-tank rounds, for example, am I over half range because I'm going to get that the -1 to the penetration modifier? But yeah, most of the time, small arms, it's
and it's much of a muchness I've found in terms of like effectiveness. It's like sometimes you're better, sometimes you're worse than V2 in terms of the modifiers and things. I do like not having to go for Super 6s most of the time. Although I'd equally, having said that, from the other side, the excitement of when you get that like once in a tournament Super 6 and then you manage to clear the secondary with the exceptional damage as well. That was sort of like a really exciting moment that obviously is now gone because we've also lost exceptional. And so it is, the game is arguably faster. I mean, it's certainly not slower. For me, I'm not a big fan of the cover saves, but that's just my personal preference But when you ask people what they like about bolt action, one of the things, like everyone always talks, the dice mechanic, the dice mechanic. But actually, the thing that I remember from the very first game I played of bolt action with Sam, friend of the podcast, Sam, was because I'd come from 40k. And I remember I had my squad of infantry and they marched up a hill or something. And then he's like, right, I'm going to shoot you. Oh, I've hit this many times. Oh, I've wounded you twice. Okay, take 2 men off. And that was it just felt brutal that they just died. They've been wounded. They're gone. Get rid of them. And that was a big shift in mindset. And that really stuck with me, just how brutal it was that once you're wounded, you're gone. There's no opportunity to save this. And it made me feel it made me play very tactically and sort of preservation of models and units. And so just philosophically, I'm not sure how I feel. I imagine in a year's time, I'll be used to it. It's not that big a deal. But it feels a bit like I imagine a lot of people would feel if you change the dice pulling mechanic.
Yeah, that's fair enough. And I haven't played 40k, so I'm not used to that cover save mechanic. I've even, it's been a few games where I've kind of forgotten it. I've got halfway through the game and I've been, I've just got, my opponent's just rolled two damage and I've got to take them off. And he's like, oh no, Phil, cover save. I'm like, ooh, okay, get a chance to save here.
Yeah, and I found it really interesting for small teams because obviously we've lost that exceptional. So it feels like small teams are really suddenly very safe. But what I've noticed is because you're rolling so few dice, you might be rolling sort of 2 cover saves on your small team. There's so few dice that it doesn't take a big probability swing for you to just lose them when you weren't expecting to.
Yeah.
And so that is interesting as well, that even without the exceptional, they can be very vulnerable to just sort of weight of fire.
Absolutely, yeah. And that sort of links to my point earlier about the HQ units, which let's move into terrain and actually the tables. I know it's not part of the rules, but my first, I think, couple of games, I basically just laid out a table as I would do for V2. And the second game, it did end up in a bit of a stalemate between me and my opponent. It wasn't by any means a sparse table. It was a standard kind of tournament, V2 table. But I've definitely noticed that there is a need to have a bit more terrain on your tables because it is brutal if you get caught in the open. And unless you've got a mechanism for getting to a certain point of the board, if you're playing an objectives mission or you're playing a movement mission, you don't want to be foot slogging across the open because if you are caught, you are going to get those pins. And if you've moved so you can't have a chance to go down and you get hit by a German squad, with 8 rifles and LMG, that's 13 dice coming your way. So yeah, I found that I've had to go back and look at my tables for tournament play and start thinking about how I'm going to make them maybe a little bit dense without chucking in like a ton, a load more buildings or ruins or woods. It's more a case of some scatter terrain, some linear obstacles, just to break it up without equally bogging the game down by just slogging through a bunch of rough ground and dense terrain.
Yeah, absolutely. I think even in V2, I liked a very dense table. And I think you're absolutely right, especially now that no matter how many pins you put on someone, it's still only -1 to hit. And that means, as you say, even if that German squad has 6 pins on it, if it manages to activate, it's going to absolutely hose you down if you happen to be stood in front of it. And I do think that's really interesting in terms of the pin mechanic, that it means you're always vulnerable, basically. No matter how much you pin someone down, you really do need to think about using the cover throughout all of that. Yeah. And so, linear obstacles, I think, because one of the other things I noticed, if I can jump to vehicle movement, is we still can't drive a Jeep through a ploughed field, which is really frustrating. So if you do fill your table with ploughed fields, you might get some extra terrain benefits in terms of the crops giving you soft cover, but it will really slow the game down because all these soft skins, which have already taken a bit of a hit, are going to be driving all the way around the outside.
Yeah, that's a fair point, and I think you just need to think about how your table plays as well as how it looks. You can produce some really, really lovely looking tables, but if effectively you've only got 1 or 2 points where any wheeled vehicles can get through, they're going to be natural choke points, which is going to be quite easy to shut down and and make it not a very enjoyable game for your opponent if that's the case.
Yeah, especially because now they're so vulnerable because you don't even go on the damage table.
Yes, so
gone, which I don't know how you feel about that. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I I don't mind that much because to be honest, I don't use vehicles with transports a huge amount. But obviously, when it was announced that soft skins now get, automatically destroyed on the six, I immediately thought of you, Johnny, and your flamethrowers, your engineers, and dodges. So for me, I didn't play V1, other than maybe like a handful of games just before I properly started playing V2. So I know it's gone back to what was in V1. Um, and if I did run vehicles as transports, because I was running a British list, it was often an Indian carrier or a brand carrier. So soft skins weren't really a big issue for me. But for you, there's something that you've used a lot and maybe will continue to use a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I view my soft skins as semi-disposable anyway. Like they're the kind of thing. So the classic advice: don't put them on for prep bombardment in V2. I often do put them on for prep bombardment because if you kill my, I don't know, my tractor with the HMG, it's not the end of the world. I've kind of brought them along, expecting not to have them by the end of the game. And again, when I'm running my Dodge Carrier list, I'm throwing them right in your face. I'm expecting for them not to be alive for very long, and
Yeah,
so
yeah.
it's not a huge change. It does, however, make the half tracks and the armor transports a little bit tastier, especially
Mm.
now that they don't always run away with proximity to the enemy.
Hmm.
And so I think we're going to see a lot of half tracks this edition. That's my suspicion.
Yeah, definitely. I've a couple of my games, my opponent's taken Germans, and you can now issue, the officer can now issue snap twos from inside a half track, so open topped armored vehicles or soft skins. So there's a great sort of double mechanic where you've got a couple of units in the 251, so 12-man capacity, a couple of 5-man units, and an officer inside a 251. Because of the German special rule where you can have an extra snap two, you can do some really interesting things with that combination. So yeah, I absolutely agree that half tracks will be something, and they're cheaper as well.
Yeah.
I've often wanted to put together, an early sort of Barbarossa list, with a ton of half
Hmm.
tracks and Panzer threes, etc. And it just wasn't really viable in V2 because of how much you were paying for half tracks. But you absolutely can do it now, both with the how cheaper or how much more both with the points reduction, but also with arguably playing at 1250, which is generally what I've been playing at as well.
Yeah. And I agree. I was already starting to play with sort of the American half tracks, German half tracks, and the only reason I hadn't sort of fully moved over to them in V2 was just you end up spending so many points that you've put a few half tracks in, and you're like, I've run out of points to buy anything of use. What am I putting in them? But now they're so cheap and they are good. Like
Hmm.
you can't really complain because small arms can't destroy them.
Yeah.
Again, now you're doing that, just jumping back to that, only ever -1 to hit no matter how many pins. The fact it's open topped doesn't matter that much, really. Your officer's inside, giving you a +2 boost, so you probably are going to keep running forward. I've played that Recce Platoon in V2 where the
Hmm.
officer basically has the rule that he has now for everyone,
Yes.
and that was a lot of fun. It was never hugely overpowered because
Mm.
you're having to put all your eggs in one basket to use it,
Mhm.
but it's always a lot of fun when you do get the dice when you need it, and then everyone just piles out of the transport. And actually, jumping back to the shooting a little bit on that, sort of like the -1 to hit. One of the big things is the jump to regular. I think is so worth it now because if you're regular, you're never hitting on a Super Six. Whereas if you're inexperienced, there's
Yeah,
a
yeah, yeah.
chance you're going to hit on a Super Six. And so actually, that jump from inexperienced to regular, I think, means if you've got a half track or someone with a gun on it, you're going to take it regular.
Yeah, if you're inexperienced firing at long range with a pin and moved, yeah, you're now on that Super Six. So, whereas if you're regular, you're never going to get to that Super Six unless it's a team weapon that's down to a single bloke. Yeah,
Yeah. And so I
yeah, yeah.
think that is going to push people away from the inexperienced transport spam
Mm,
that people don't really like to see.
mhm,
And I think, and also like jumping back to the officers,
mhm.
even your squads, it really makes regular troops the sweet spot for me now. I think. I mean, what do you
Mhm.
think? Like, are vets still worth it for you?
I've been I mean I generally don't play with inexperienced troops because I don't play Soviets and I don't play Germans very often, and when I play Japanese I'm not using too often the inexperienced militia. So I've played quite a few games with regular US Marines. I've played quite a few games with veteran British Paras, etc. Um, you know, 8 regulars, they can die quite easily if you get stuck in the open. So I need to play a few more and play around with squad sizes actually. And something I have found is that the smaller squad sizes that you might have been able to have got away with in V2, for me, I haven't seen that happening. I've found that those smaller squads, if they're caught, in soft cover, having moved so they can't go down, or they're caught in the open, etc. They are going quite easily. So that wasn't the question you asked, but I've been using regulars quite a bit, but I need to maybe try out a few more combinations before having a definitive view.
Yeah, I think I'm still going to keep on the small squads. I like to push around, and again, that disposable mindset that like I might lose a squad here, I might lose a squad there, but again, jumping back to needing to put out lots of pins quickly. Having smaller squads, I think, is still going to be the way that I play. But in terms of the veteran regular, I think I totally agree. Inexperienced, not for me. I never have been really, to be honest. So it's not like that's a change. But whether the veterans are worth it, I'm not sure now. But I guess time will tell.
I mean, I quite like playing with my British powers, and I'm going to be building some tropical fortune makers, so I'm kind of leaning into the veterans anyway because of my own choices. So.
Yeah. Well, for me, the thought on the veterans is because I'm thinking I don't really care that much if the squads die. Like as long as I've got other stuff coming up, and the officers are so prolific now that the morale boost isn't that big a deal. Although, having said that, now that the maximum morale is 11. The odds of you failing on 11, it's 1 in 36, so you're almost guaranteed to get going. So if your vets have one pin with an officer behind, 35 times out of 36 you're going. And so maybe that is the argument for the veterans, that because of that boosted morale. So it's nice. Maybe the veterans do have a place.
Just before we maybe have a think about failing morale checks, just another quick thing on vehicles. The double pivot for all vehicles on an advance makes a big difference, and
absolutely,
it makes it makes tracked vehicles on an advance just way more. Not that they weren't usable before, but the ability to change direction up to twice 90 degrees, I think is great.
Oh, it's huge. Yeah, I think the two big winners from that are your hull mounted weapons like your Stug and your Stew, and your flamethrower. So like a Wasp, being able to do a pivot. It's huge in terms of if you're really driving a Stug up the table, sometimes you can find yourself just not quite being able to get arc in V2. And so, I'm loving the double pivot.
Yeah, I mentioned the Type 92 tankette from the Japanese in the context of the Welsh Open. I've played 2 games now against the Japanese, and when they've had the Type 92 tankette with that double pivot, so you can get that whole mounted HMG, pointing towards things, it's been brilliant for my opponent, not for me, to be fair. But...
Yeah, and I do think it's nice in terms of like the game's mechanics. I think it's nice that they've added the road sort of exception for tracked vehicles, because you've given them that extra maneuverability generally, but by taking away the roads, it means they're not going to be as open to abuse, because it'd be very easy for a Stug or something to push 18 inches down the road really quickly, turn to get just the right angle on, and shoot you. And so I'm really liking that combination of sort of one benefit and one loss kind of thing.
Yeah. So just to be clear, tracked vehicles no longer get double speed on the road. So wheeled vehicles can still double speed on an advance or a run, but tracked can only move at their normal advance or run rate. Yeah, which does stop you from, driving that Panther, down the road on an advance, 18 inches into the middle of the board and going, right, deal with me, or you send your Churchill Crocodile, which is stupidly high armor, all the way around kind of thing. So yeah.
And your half tracks, Phil?
Well, half tracks, well, they're wheeled. They move like wheeled vehicles, don't they?
So
actually, that's a good question. You put me on the spot there. Don't they? No, they have the distance of tracked vehicles, but I don't know.
To the library. Let's go.
Because it used to be that they moved. They were able to move like tracked vehicles, but the maneuverability of
a wheeled vehicle,
vehicles. But they've all got that now because they can pivot twice.
Yeah, so for anyone following along in the rule book, if you've got it in hand already, well done to you. But for anyone listening in the future, when obviously everyone has it, it's around 130 is where you're looking. The actual page for roads specifically, checking the index. Here we go, page 77 actually for roads, surprisingly.
Oh, that's the first time the table appears. That's why.
Oh,
Or
and
page
so
one.
is this one of those examples where we could do with a couple of references throughout?
The other page is 133, which is where it
So,
talks about wheeled vehicles and movement. Oh, that's a really good question. I haven't actually picked up on that yet.
oh, here we go. So, nothing on the table I can see about half tracks yet. To the index. Back to the index. Page for half tracks, you're looking at. Oh, half tracks aren't in the index.
To the for selection section.
I think I'm going back to 130. I think that's where you're going to find stuff about half tracks in vehicle movement. So vehicles start at 129. Vehicles and movement is 133.
One eternity later.
Where the flip are half tracks? Have they just not put half tracks in here?
Maybe they are just tracked vehicles. Because the thing was that they had the double pivot, but everyone gets that now. This may be a complete waste of listeners' time. Sorry.
I don't think so. I think this is. I think it's hugely useful because obviously, if we're having this discussion, there's going to be tabletops up and down the country where this is happening.
I'm looking at the German force selector, and there's nothing in any of the half track entries to say
how they move.
Different. Yeah.
Even in the vehicle special rules, you've got like amphibious, etc.
Yeah.
But there's nothing for half tracks in there.
Oh.
I actually don't know where half track rules would be in the rulebook. Where were they in V2?
Oof, now you're asking. Well, they were certainly in the selection bit because it. Oh, no, were they? Oh.
To the PDF.
To the PDF. Hold on.
One eternity later.
Oh, well, I've sent us down a bit of a rabbit hole here. I was rather expecting that you would just have the answer on hand, if I'm honest, because have you not? I mean, I haven't played one yet. Have you played against one yet?
Yeah. We just didn't put it down the road, so the question didn't come up.
Oh, so terrain, page 133.
Yeah.
The effect on movement, including vehicles, has already been described on page 75. But for ease of reference, the terrain table is repeated below. Note that half-tracked vehicles use the tracked vehicles column, except that they do double their move on roads, like wheeled vehicles.
Okay, there we go.
Perfect.
I was just looking at that. I just didn't read it.
So that's really good because otherwise I think half-tracks wouldn't be getting their day in the sun. I think because they do get that, they really will surpass all of the wheeled vehicles. I think the only wheeled vehicles that might get a good showing, I actually think stuff like the M3 White Scout car.
Oh, yes.
Armored wheeled, you're getting the best of both worlds. And it's open top, so your fella can shout at the top.
It's got a good transport capacity as well.
Yeah.
The Indian pattern carrier, although it's not.
Agree.
No, it is in the main rulebook as a recce vehicle. But yeah, things like the Indian pattern carrier for the Brits would be really good as well for that reason.
Yeah, the French are suffering a little bit because my favourite French that transport the Vud, he's closed, and so you really miss out on that big benefit of being able to shout from the top.
Yeah,
but the French also have a lot of good transport, so I'm sure they'll be all right in the long run. It's just sad if you've just went out and bought a fleet of Vuds. Should we jump forward a little bit to some more new rules?
Yeah, so just sticking with the vehicles, the damage table. This caused a bit of chat on Facebook because there are now two damage tables. You've got your superficial damage and your full damage. Marcus went on, I think it was the Cast Dice pod, I think it was the official Warlord Games pod with Brad, and talked about it. And he said it's really straightforward. And it is really straightforward in the sense of, have I equaled the armor? Have I gone over the armor? if I've equaled it, roll on one table. If I've gone over, roll on another table. There's none of this roll on one table at -3 if you've equaled it anymore. So it is straightforward. That said, we do still have turret jam as one of the options in the superficial damage, which was something that was rarely played at events, probably rarely played in casual games. So that is still there, but having two tables actually is really straightforward. Have I equaled the armor value? Have I exceeded it? And then
Yeah.
you just roll on the right one.
From me, again, like the cover saves, I don't like this just personally. As a games mechanic, I don't have a huge problem with it. I think it's fine. Many game systems have done this. It works. But there's two things I don't like. The first is I hate remembering things. I hate when you have the more things you make a wargamer remember, the more things they're just definitely going to forget, basically. And so having lots of rules where, oh, if you were fast, now you're not fast, don't forget that. Oh, your turret's jammed, don't forget that. Oh, your steering's compromised, don't forget that. I'm not a big fan of having to remember those things. Obviously, we'll develop a whole system with chits and all the rest of it. That'll be fine. But I just don't like that philosophically. And it's funny that saying no one did turret jam because they'd always forget about it or just didn't like it. It's funny we've added additional rules that are very similar to turret jam, like the steering compromised and the engine damage. And I do wonder how much the bolt action community is going to go for these rules and how much they're going to sort of like dislike them to like them or just be indifferent.
Yeah, I mean, in the games I've played, it has come up. I have had superficial damage against me, and my opponent has as well. And it's been straightforward to remember. There's a market there for someone to produce some chits.
100%, yeah.
On eBay or Etsy. Just little things you could just leave. And it's the same with no leader. No leader, no NCO. Particularly with regards to artillery and team weapons now, where not having that leader because the sniper's taking it out does have an impact on the overall morale. So yeah, there's a whole chit market about to appear in eBay and Etsy if it hasn't already. So
yeah, and I haven't had it yet really where for me one of them not too bad, but if you manage to get like all three of the cumulative effects,
yeah,
you're gonna be like, oh wait a minute, so I can't do this and I can't do this. But actually while we're talking about shooting at tanks, one of the things that I found a little bit frustrating so far is because we've moved to cover saves instead of being hard to hit. When you get that big hit and your bazooka manages to penetrate the panther on a 5 and you're delighted, and then they just roll the cover save and nothing happens. I've found that really demoralizing. And it's made me, and it's one of the problems I have with the changes to vehicles generally, that I was really hoping for like more firepower, because the one shot from the big tank gun it's not enough. And so they've made the vehicles cheaper, which is good, but you've reduced their machine gun shots. So that kind of offsets that. And because we haven't increased the big cannon's rate of fire or done anything with it really, I'm not convinced that sort of medium plus vehicles have gotten any tastier than they did in V2.
With the cover save, it does say a recommendation is to roll the cover save before you roll for damage to prevent your disappointment.
I mean, that's still demoralizing, though, isn't it?
Yeah, and actually that's a good point, because in terms of like small arms fire, we've been doing it as to hit, to damage, to save, whereas for vehicles we've been doing it as to hit and then cover save, and then if we fail that, then we roll to damage. I'm not sure if I will stick that way or if I'll go another way in terms of to hit, to save, and then to damage. But yeah, I haven't played with huge amounts of big armored vehicles. I've had a Firefly, we've had a Sherman, we've had a Lee, had a Panzer III, but haven't necessarily been taking like the really big, really big armor, the German armor, or like a Flak 88 to try out that sort of stuff. So
yeah, I was playing with a Chaffee and a Greyhound the other day, which was a lot of fun. Just the kind of stuff I wasn't really running much in V2 because it's, and that was the exact experience. I was like, oh, if only I could just put out a little bit more firepower, because they're a lot of fun, especially now your Chaffee's got lots of pivots, great fun, but. It was just not being able to damage other people's tanks when they're in cover. It was really frustrating. And so the one that I do think that you've mentioned will still have a place is the Lee. So anything that has two big guns, I think that still has a home in bolt action.
Yeah, and so the Lee I played against a Japanese list, which was a bit of a gun line, and the Lee was like, "Yeah, whatever." it just sat in the middle of my line. It was had the 2-inch from the medium AT, it had the 1-inch if it needed to from the light AT, and it had the coupler MG as well. And I just basically sat it next to some woods or it's jungle. With an officer behind out of sight, and he was just buffing it. So the Lee was taking pins, but it was just shrugging it off.
Yeah.
But yeah, vehicles that have a decent armor with multiple weapons, they are expensive, but they're, again, if you're playing at slightly higher points totals, which I have been doing, I think we might see them a bit more.
Yeah, talking of the pins on the vehicles, actually, a change that I really like is your regular vehicles pins, where any heavy weapon does a pin now, and there's none of this half the time. It makes, in the same way that I think the shooting mechanics have made regulars worth so much more than experienced troops, I think that it might not have made veteran vehicles worth it, but the fact that regular vehicles are always pinned, regardless of whether you can hurt them or not, makes the veteran ones just a little bit more tempting.
Yeah, that Type 92 tankette, it's got even better now you've just mentioned that, because it's got an HMG in the hole. Ping, take a pin. I can't penetrate, doesn't matter, have a pin.
Yeah, and the funny thing is, actually, with the machine gun rule of half shots on vehicles, because they've boosted the HMG to 6 shots for the infantry, which makes it almost worth taking. Like, I'm on the fence with him at the minute. I've tried him, and he is actually quite good having those 6 shots of +1. But at the end of V2, I was already starting to play with Dodgers with HMGs on it. And in V2, I was only getting 3 shots. And I was finding it to be quite effective. Now, the points haven't changed very much. And I'm still getting 3 shots exactly the same, but now with extra range. And so I do think HMGs are going to be a big auto-include for vehicles where you can get them.
Yeah, it's the same. Yeah, you were running your artillery tractor with an HMG, weren't you? Which is a bit of a mobile cover when it blew up, but it was also also quite useful at putting out some HMG shots. Yeah,
absolutely. But he is still only soft cover though, all the soft skins. Yeah, I did notice that line in there. So even if you're behind the engine block, just be careful. Still only soft. But equally going down now.
Well, just to jump on that in terms of it is now clear that a soft skin vehicle gives soft cover and a hard skin vehicle gives hard cover. There are some really nice quality of life changes, and Warlord have taken on board the FAQ responses from V2. The ones, some of them have made their way into V3. Others that maybe weren't as satisfactory as FAQ or errata responses have been reworded. We'll talk about assaults in a bit more depth, but the general the guidance about movement with regards to assaults in terms of in cover, out cover, through cover, over obstacles, over impassable terrain, that's really clear now. The process for an escape move, if you've got a recce vehicle, there are certain criteria that you need to meet. You start with this criteria, then you move to the second, then you move to the third. Because the response in the V2 errata wasn't as clear as it could be. The fact that, like you just said, soft skin vehicles are soft cover, hard skins, armored vehicles are hard cover, all that sort of stuff. So there's some really nice quality of life changes where they've just tidied up some key parts of the rule book from V2. And it, I've certainly found in my games where we haven't been head scratching as much as we might have been when we were playing V2, and not kind of completely au fait with the rules like we became towards the end of the V2 time.
Yeah, and the big one mentioned in the cover then is of tidying up. It's not so much a tidy up because the rule was fairly obvious, but it was one of those ones where everyone was playing it wrong and they've just lent into that direction. Is the dense terrain.
1 inch, 1 inch dense terrain. Because
everyone was playing that. If you're shooting through less than an inch of dense terrain,
even if you weren't at the edge,
But, and now that is the rule. You no longer have to be at the edge. It also nicely tidies up the assaults because if you're not 100%. Touching the edge, you're not chargeable without crossing the terrain. It's a really nice change that actually I think doesn't make a huge difference other than the fact that it's just one less thing you have to really worry about. Am I touching the edge? Especially on those sort of beautiful tables where it's hard to place models. And you're having to say to your opponent, no, these ones are on the edge, but because it's not flat, I'm going to pull them back a little bit, but they're on the edge.
Yeah, people who I play regularly got into a habit of going, and this, Phil, is on the edge. And this, Phil, is not on the edge, because I'd always be like, are you on the edge? Can I assault you? Can I not assault you? We haven't got that anymore. So
Yeah, and it's a bit like the shooting one where you're no longer measuring the short range. And so in the same way, you're no longer having to worry about, are you on the edge? And I think that's a nice tidy up.
yeah.
Even though, as I say, I don't think it was particularly unclear in V2.
Assaults.
Assaults.
Let's talk about assaults.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't a big assaulter.
No, you weren't.
I've never been a big assaulter, if I'm honest. If I'm that close, I'm gonna whip out a flamethrower, aren't I? Let's be honest.
Yeah.
And
or
so
maybe some SMGs if you've got some points left over.
Yeah, and so from my perspective, the changes to assault aren't huge. They're actually kind of beneficial to me because most of the time, when I used to run Paragurkas, I used to run them with SMGs, and then I would just sit in cover, and I was using them defensively, basically, so that if you want to charge me, I've got a good chance of winning. And so actually, I'm really liking the new assault rules.
Yeah. As am I, and the reason why I sort of pulled a face when I mentioned it is because I like using Gurkhas, I like using my Japanese, I like using my Senegalese with my French, all of which are very assault orientated. So you would think that I'd be a bit like, oh, they've changed assaults, I'm never going to assault, and so on. I haven't found that. No longer am I going to charge 8 Gurkhas, across open ground into a squad that's fresh, because chances are, because assaults are now simultaneous as a default, chances are that they're not necessarily going to come off best. Certainly, if it's just regular tough fighters who aren't Gurkhas and aren't halving hits, etc. But I like the fact that the default is simultaneous, and yet if you're in a defended position, it's defender goes first. That makes sense. I haven't assaulted as much, but I still have assaulted. There still is a place for assaults. And I said earlier, spoiler alert, we'll talk about this when we talk about assaults. Sometimes in order to shift the unit out of rough ground, if they keep going down, well, actually, if you can force them down and then assault them, they lose that defensive bonus. So it then becomes simultaneous rather than defender goes first. You do have to set it up. I found with assaults, if I'm putting small arms fire in and or putting HE in, I need to whittle down the squad before I go in and assault. But there still is a place for assaults. And if you're talking about, engineers ignore a defensive position in buildings. It's not any rough ground or any defensive position. It's only in buildings. So if you play on tables where you've got a lot of city fighting going on in buildings, your engineers may be useful in that context as well.
Yeah, and one thing to bear in mind, jumping back to the shooting but tying into the assaults, is there's a bit of chat about point blank and its effects on cover. And just to clarify, it doesn't ignore cover, but it does ignore down.
Yes.
And so that's one of those situations where if you've got 2 squads pushing up at you and one of them's going to try and whittle you down with point blank shooting so the other one can charge in, you're not going to get the benefit of down. So actually stay on your feet and take this shooting. If you survive that shooting, then at least you get to go first when they charge into, I don't know, the bunker you're hiding in or whatever, as long as they're not engineers.
I found that where there is no benefit to going down if you're in point blank range. Obviously, if you're in cover, you get the cover save. Normally, my default in V2, if I was likely to get wiped out, I'd be like, I'll go down. You don't have that problem anymore, so you are better staying on your feet. Because if you do survive, you still got that dice. If you haven't activated, obviously, and had a chance to go down, you've still got that opportunity to do something.
Yeah, and point blank is good now.
It's very.
I mean, +2 to hit. It's why they've moved the base to a 4+. I think because otherwise you're always going to be hitting on a 2-up, and so the first turn you advance, you're hitting on a 3-up usually, and then if you stay there for the next turn, you're hitting on that 2-up. And it's the way to go basically, and I think that's probably also why they've increased the cost of all the SMGs and the assault rifles and stuff, because it's point blank. Very good. Try and use it.
Yeah, I've certainly found in my games when I've been able to get forward with SMGs, it's been brutal.
No. Oh, one thing I wanted to discuss about assaults actually was Tough Fighter, because that was one of the ones that I saw some grumbles about, the new Tough Fighter, because people like the old Tough Fighter. I think I actually prefer new Tough Fighter, where you re-roll your missed hits. And I like it for the same reason people liked templates, which I'm not that big a fan of. But the reason people liked the adoption of templates was because you didn't get that overkill. And tough fighters the same, where your 2 men can't put out 4 wounds, but they can reliably put out 2 wounds. And I think it helps you. Yeah, I think it makes the game more fun, if I'm honest.
Yeah, and I've not noticed it as being a major, a major issue. It feels a bit more realistic in some ways in terms of, you're really good at close quarters, you miss, well, you're going to have another go, as opposed to you're really good at close quarters, you kill one, and I've killed somebody else straight away.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's also, I found it really nice for balancing the odds as well.
Yeah.
So we've all had that close quarters where 10 men and don't do a single wound. And now at least you get a couple wounds. You're almost guaranteed to get a couple wounds if you've paid for 10 tough fighters. Yeah. And so it nicely balances out the odds, whereas all tough fighters, if you fluff that first roll, it's just over. Just pick your models up, take them home. And so I'm liking that change personally. Yeah. And while we're talking about templates, actually, I have a few thoughts on templates. The first one was that I've never been a big fan of templates. I find it just a little bit fiddly. I much prefer just randomized wounds in some way. There's many different ways to do it, but I'm not a big fan of templates. But if we are going to do templates, I wish I'd got a flamethrower template. That's a gaping omission in my eyes.
Spot the X40K player.
Yeah, and then the other thought that I had on templates, and this one's the other side of the coin, a positive change, is there's no more snaky boys with your 1-inch multiple blasts. So if you've got that whirlwind, you got that whirlwind that's putting out 8 1-inch templates, you no longer have to do your sort of like this template touches, and just a little bit fiddly. At least that faff's gone. You just place them where they get hits, basically.
Yeah. And they've reduced the pins as well, haven't they, on some of the template sizes?
Yeah, I was going to talk about that when we get to artillery, but that's probably a good point to jump in with because my thoughts of this, basically, your 2-inch, like your medium motor, now only does D2 pins rather than D3.
Yeah.
And I already was on the fence about the medium motor at the end of D2. I was saying, never leave home without heavy.
Yeah.
I think they've made my case even more for me, yeah.
To be fair, when I played a game the other day with a British airborne platoon with 3 medium mortars, and I was like, just not putting out enough pins. And then I immediately thought, and Johnny's going to talk about heavy mortars when we get onto this on the pod.
Yeah, there's not a big jump in points, basically. And now everyone can use each other's spotters. I mean, I had this exact thing at the weekend at Welsh Open. One of the things I was talking about in terms of times when I've played and I wish I had other things, and my medium motor hit the Panther and it can't do anything basically because it can just glance. And I thought my Iwo Jima list couldn't take a heavy, so that's why I didn't have one.
Yeah.
But I would have definitely wanted one. And one of the other things I really missed was that sharing the spotters, my howitzer and the mortar. At one point I lost the howitzer spotter, and I thought if this was V3, this wouldn't really matter.
Yeah, I like that mechanic where you can use, a spotter for different HE. And like I said, I've been running a British airborne with 3 mortars, which has been cool. Like I've had two rifle platoons and a heavy weapons platoon with 3 mortars, and Piats are in the rifle platoon to give me a little bit of AT. I've really enjoyed building those kind of lists and just playing around with them to get used to the game mechanics and how the game how the game runs.
Yeah, and I think the artillery paired with the mortars now, or even I think being able to use the spotters for all indirect has given the light mortar, especially with its additional range, it's really given the light mortar a place in army lists where I think previously it didn't have a place because it's doing so little damage and it's doing so few pins. But now you can put that infantry squad, potentially, if it's in an infantry squad like with the Japanese, you can put them behind a hill, just lobbing shells over the top. And yes, you're not doing a lot of damage, but you really are starting to pester infantry.
Yeah, I have mixed views on that in the sense of a unit that isn't able to take a spotter is now able to use a spotter, rules as written in the rule book. So I agree with your point that you can stick a grenadier squad, or if the French get the grenade
the VB,
launchers, for example,
love it.
They could do the same thing. It's not my favorite rule, if I'm honest, because it feels a bit like, well, you can't take a spotter anyway, so why should you benefit from the ability of a spotter? But that's for a separate episode potentially.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll have a full half hour on that one topic at some point.
Yeah.
But equally from the other side, how do you feel about it for the indirect tanks? So things like the priest. how do you feel about him using the spotter? Because I'm liking that a lot.
Yeah, that said, it does make sense. So things like a centaur, for example,
Mm-hmm.
I play commandos, like a centaur or a priest, where they were using an indirect fire role. And obviously in V2, you had to have, line of sight because you couldn't use a spotter. I'm going to contradict myself here, though, and also say, yeah, but they wouldn't have been that close. Yeah, they wouldn't have been that close up necessarily on the battlefield. Maybe the centaur would, but the priest would probably be behind the lines a little bit, where the stuff was going on. So, again, without going into a massive conversation about scale and about which kind of units and which kind of weapons and ordnance we should see on the battlefield, I can see their use in terms of howitzers and indirect firing howitzers. I'm just not too,
And I think the problem with the argument of sort of the minimum range and stuff is it does mean all of our artillery kind of goes away as well, doesn't it? Which is why I think we're generally quite happy to make a little bit of a mental leap for some of the units. Because otherwise you would have to play 2 games with your artillery pieces on another table behind you.
Yeah.
While your infantry charges up.
Yeah, it's Hollywood wargaming, isn't it? So I was actually talking about this at the weekend, and there's a fan made modern version of bolt action where effectively anything other than a very small caliber mortar is represented by offboard artillery and offboard ordnance for that very, very same reason. So
yeah, and while we're talking about stuff that should have an incredibly long range, I think it would be good to talk about the elephant in the room. Which is our old friend, the multiple rocket launchers systems.
Yeah.
Now, the minimum range, you're talking like kilometers for a lot of these systems.
It's an interesting one because obviously it says in the unit profile for a multi-launcher, you treat it like a heavy mortar, which includes the minimum range. And the minimum range of mortars has stayed at 12. The minimum range for howitzers has increased. And there's been a lot of talk, hasn't there, on the internet about multi-launcher spam and snap to, take a company commander, do your multiple snap twos, all that kind of stuff. It is possible to do it. Whether or not it's a good idea is another thing entirely. In an objectives mission, if you spent a huge amount of points, or not a huge amount, but not a small amount of points on building that horrific multi-launcher major combo or company commander combo, you still got to have a infantry at some point to take objectives.
Yeah, it
but
is.
Yeah, but that wasn't your point. The point was about the minimum range.
Yeah, but to be honest, I was just feeding you that as a line so we could start talking about them. Because
Poke the bear.
Because it is. I've obviously tried pushing the limits on the system already to see.
Well, that doesn't sound like you, Johnny.
To see, basically, because if we're going to run the English Open very soon after V3 is released, I wanted to know what I should be keeping an eye out for when we're getting these list submissions. And I tried sort of your flamethrowers.
Yeah.
I've tried high explosive mortars. The only thing that I found that is like a point that the only thing that I found is very difficult to counter is that multi-launcher spam. Because as you say, like, you need to take other things. They're still incredibly cheap.
They are still cheap. Yeah.
Even though you're not going to hit anything necessarily. Are you going to force your opponent down turn 1? Quite possibly. And then you've seized basically that entire first turn.
Yes.
And so it is one that I think does need an amendment. The proposed amendment from friend of the podcast, Sam, was that forget about firing them as heavy mortars, treat them as light howitzers. And I think that's the perfect solution, to be honest, because 30-inch minimum means you can very easily rush them, whereas 12-inch minimum, incredibly hard to rush them. And again, the 2-inch template is enough to make them like worth taking, but not so much that they're auto-deleting units on a 6, basically.
Yeah, I think if I'm potentially getting hit on a 6 by a 2-inch template, I probably, unless like there's no need to stay up, I probably wouldn't go down. However, if it's you might hit this on the 3-inch template, I've got 8 blokes, they're fairly close together, I've just lost an entire squad. If I've only taken one squad one rifle platoon, so I've only got potentially 4 squads anyway, that is a big thing. Yeah, definitely.
Oh, absolutely. And it's also the interesting thing was the thing that I was really checking the fine print on when we first got the rules set was the snap twos, because once we'd seen the composition rules, And the fact that I was being forced to take loads of officers, and suddenly the officers are really good because they can do 2 snap 2s each. I really was ready to check that fine print to see how it worked, because I had terrible visions of, you've got your German company commander and he snaps 2 17 dice, basically.
Yeah.
But what's really nice is they're very clearly, and like full credit to the rules writers, it's very clearly written that you can't snap to a same rank. So a platoon commander can't snap to a platoon commander, and also if you've been snapped, you can't snap
yourself. Yeah. So a company commander can't snap a platoon commander, who can then go on and snap to other units.
Yeah, but so that's really nice. It means you can't just play 40k. But on the other side of the coin, I was playing with Americans with the rocket launchers, just testing that out. They're not actually in the big rule books, but we were just working on the assumption that it's like a Nebel, because I think they'll get them in the long run. And just being able to snap 2 of them simultaneously was huge for just early game, first turn. People have set up. They haven't had that opportunity to spread out and hide yet. And so if you are coming to the English Open, you can expect that there probably will be an amendment to the multi-launchers. So expect to see them firing like light howitzers. In terms of the rest of the composition, Phil, is there anything else we need to worry about in terms of army composition, or are you enjoying the way that armies are written now?
No, I'm really enjoying the new structure. It was, that was the first article that came out, and I was really excited by it because it allows you to build, if you want to, it allows you to build much more thematic historical lists. Straight away I was thinking about, I really want to build a market garden list, with a bunch of British airborne being supported or reinforced by 30 Corps, etc. I like the fact that you in order to take the other platoons, you've got to take minimum of 1 rifle platoon. What I found in my games, I generally have always played with 5 or even 6 infantry squads in V2. So only having 4 infantry squads in V3 in a single rifle platoon has meant that I've looked at either running two rifle platoons, or thinking about an engineer platoon if it's available to that nation, or the recce platoon. But I really like the platoon structure. Again, talking about it over the weekend with Mark, the TA from the Welsh Open. Mark was one of the playtesters, and his name's in the back of the book and so on. It's not like rock, paper, scissors. It's rock, paper, scissors, and 2 other things.
Lizard Spock.
In the sense that there might be a build that works really, really well, against two other builds, or works really, really well against a particular terrain type or particular table density or whatever. But there'll be something that can counter it. It'll be really interesting when we start having a few more events and tournaments going on over the next 6 months and so on, and we start to see what sort of things are working and what aren't working. If you want to, you can take, an inexperienced officer, 2 inexperienced 5-man squads, do that twice, and then take 2 armored platoons and have an absolutely beast of an armored platoon. Start playing an objective game. That's going to be really difficult, especially now in something like key positions where you could have 7 objectives. I like the platoon structure. I like the different combinations you can do. As I said, earlier on, I've been building lists that aren't kind of min-max and aren't OP, and I've been enjoying building them to particular themes. I played a US Marine beach landing theme the other day with AM tanks and buffaloes, which you just couldn't do in V2, because there wasn't a US Marine selector that allows you to take more than 1 AM tank, for example. I really like it. It leans into what I enjoy about the game, which is not just the game itself; it's the history, and it's the theming and the modelling and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, one of the things I'm kind of on the fence about it. I don't mind it either way. I liked being able to just take 1 of things, but equally, I am really enjoying having loads of officers about. So, because I'm liking how quick that makes the game, because everyone's snapping all the time. One of the things I'm struggling with at the minute is finding a use for the infantry, sort of the rifle platoon, and that's more because we just don't have that much choice yet, and so it's sort of like, here's just rifle squads, and so I'm finding it quite difficult to get myself excited about the rifle platoon. In the same way that I'm excited about building an armor platoon, where I'm like, oh, I'm going to put a tiger in, I'm going to put this in. And one of the things that I find is a really interesting sort of mechanic shift is now that Panzerfaust are so expensive, you're really forced to you can't just run rifle sections.
No.
Whereas in V2 you could have just ran German infantry all day long and
Or
won
Soviets,
every game.
yeah, with Panzerfaust, yeah.
But now they're so expensive. 15 points of Faust it makes them almost unplayable, I would argue. I mean, they do have one huge benefit, but it's one that is very situational, which is against buildings. So I don't know if you noticed, but against buildings, they count as a 2-inch HE.
Yeah, so this was in the D-Day book. I think it's in the D-Day Overlord book. They had that special rule for certain theatre selectors where the US were using bazookas as bunker busters, and they've effectively taken that rule and put it into the main rulebook of V3. Actually, that just as a side point, what is really nice is how they've taken some of the really cool rules that appeared in V2 campaign books and dropped them into the V3 book as part of the core rule set, or as part of the optional rules at the back where you've got all the weather features and terrain features and that kind of stuff. I really like that. There's a real it's way more of a set, if you like, as a main rulebook than the V2 main rulebook was.
Yeah, Fieldcraft was a big one for that, because how many versions of Fieldcraft did we have?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it depending on who the author was and so on. I was saying this at the weekend. If you're a really casual bolt action player and you just want to play with the 5 main nations and you want to use the get you buy list when they come out, you don't need to necessarily buy an armies of book, because you can take sufficiently different things just to play casually with your mate once a month kind of thing. Obviously, if you want, like you said, if you want to get excited and actually put some flavor into your army, you are going to want to get the armies of books when they come out, because whilst the lists are expanded in the main rulebook compared to V2, they are still fairly straightforward. But as a kind of like standalone product, the book in that sense is perfectly fine for someone who just wants to pick it up and play it once every couple of months with their mate in their garage, sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think players can expect very similar army list in the V3 rulebook as you got in the V2 rulebook in terms of what you're getting to play your armies. You've actually got quite a bit more in terms of than you realize at first glance, because they've squeezed lots of units into a single entry, where it's like the tanks are the perfect example of it, where you'll have the generic Sherman entry and then you'll have 6 different options to make all the different types of Shermans off the back of that entry. And I imagine they'll get spread out into unique entries when we get to the army books.
It's sort of been referred to as like a Build-A-Bear kind of thing, and it's not quite like that. You can't like build some Frankensteinian monster where you just take one rule from one type of Sherman and one rule from another and merge it all together. But it is really clear in terms of the full selection. It's here's your basic, let's take the light armored car. The basic light armored car for Germans is a 222. Here's your basic 222. You can make it a 223 by reducing the points and changing the armament, or you can make it another version of a light armor car similar to a 222, but it's actually this particular spec. Likewise with the Shermans, the Lee and the Grant, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, they've condensed the page coverage of the units, but there actually are a lot of options in there. I'd say there's actually more options in the basic rulebook than there was in the V2 basic rulebook.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But it's similar sort of vibe where you just know that you're going to get a lot more once we get to the actual.
Yeah, to be honest, it feels I've not done the comparison. Kind of feels like you've got the initial armies of books from V2 or even V1 are now effectively the main rulebook options, and obviously they need to keep stuff back in order to justify the actual armies of book, which would suggest I don't know if I'm right or not. It's just a gut feeling, but certainly looking at the British main rulebook options is pretty much what was in the armies of GB, I think.
Similar sort of unit quantity.
Japan, it definitely is, because the Japanese armies of Japan were so small in V2 or V1.
The place where I'm hoping for some modifications are in the national characteristics, though. So the Brits only have 2 here, which is very light on the ground. The US ones, I'm not particularly pleased with. As a US player,
and there's been talk, hasn't there, about the fire maneuvers change, and the fire maneuver now is basically what the British rapid fire was in V2 and V1. But it's easy to understand why, because if one of the few modifiers you now get for shooting or to hit is for moving, if the US ignore that completely, they're going to be even more likely to hit, obviously. I may have opened up a
So
big can of worms here.
yeah, so I've actually, you can expect a full analysis video on this, I imagine, on our YouTube channel at some point. But if you look at the actual statistics, you're doing about the same damage. I mean,
Okay.
if anything, the new fire maneuver is more powerful, but the time it's more powerful is when you stand still. And so, as a competitive player, I actually don't mind this from a competitive perspective, but I do really dislike it from a how the army feels to play perspective, because not only are you encouraging players to stand still with a rule called fire and maneuver, you also haven't included the BAR, which is about as sort of like Hollywood history, US at war, as the Tommy gun. And so I'm really hoping that when this is rewritten, at the very least, we get the BAR added. It does feel, though, if I can move back to a positive, that they've made Germany great again.
Germany's really good.
Yeah, like, because this, it's not even just that, like, they've got all the toys and all the rest of it. Their rules really synergize with basically all of the changes to V3.
Yeah. I am going to start the Make Britain Great Again campaign because, they're not very good anymore, apparently.
I mean, they're fine. They're fine.
They are fine. They are fine. Yeah.
They're just not they're not Germany, basically, is what we're saying.
They're not uber fine. Yeah.
Yeah. And America's fine. They're just not. I don't know. I'm a bit sad about my Americans, to be honest. So you'll have to ask me in 12 months how I feel about America.
And actually that's a fair point. We will do an episode in 6 months. What's the state of the game, and likewise in 12 months, because it will be really interesting to see what is going to happen in terms of general casual play, in terms of what happens in terms of events and tournaments and that sort of stuff. So
yeah, and we're going to get our quarterly releases, aren't we, on our army books? So that'll be the natural time for us to talk about the new armies.
We know that Germany's coming out in July, US is coming out in April, and Britain, isn't it? It's coming out in. Sorry, let's start that again. Germany's coming out in January, US is coming out in April, and Britain's coming out in July. I believe Amazon's got them all up on pre-order, so you're able to actually look at the dates now via Amazon. Yeah.
Very nice. And I mean, the one thing that I do really like is something that we really pushed for on the pod, which was to get rid of free units, because, and reading the copy, reading what Marcus wrote about it, it's very much for the similar reasons to what we said, where you've got these new players rocking up to 400-point games playing against an opponent with 500 points.
Yeah.
And so I do really like that. I think the Soviets haven't really been hindered too much by it. And the other thing, actually thinking about the composition, is I do think it's going to be really good for new players, because you can rock up and in your first game, you can do a rifle platoon versus a rifle platoon. And that keeps the rules really simple and very core. And then you can say, okay, next time we'll add an armored platoon to it. So now we're adding the vehicle rules. And you can just expand out platoon by platoon, can't you, until you know all the rules, basically.
Yeah, there's been a bit of chat as well about the starter armies and how useful they are in V3. And actually, a lot of them are absolutely more than useful, because quite often you get a mortar and an MG, in the starter army boxes. So you can build a rifle platoon, then you can add your heavy weapon platoon. You only need one artillery piece to create an artillery platoon with a platoon commander. So you can do that. You probably will need to buy a second armored vehicle to create an armored platoon, but actually the V2 starter army boxes nicely map over onto V3 with very minimal updates. The things that lots of people are going to need to do is paint up some more platoon commanders if you haven't got a stack load lying around. But it's perfectly possible to take your V2 army and pretty much replicate it in V3 if you want to. That said, I don't necessarily recommend trying to do that, because I think the beauty of the new platoon structures is that you can. I know you said earlier that you like the whole one-off idea. The beauty of the new platoon structure is that you can do that multiple, and which you used to be able to do in theatre selectors, or if you played double generic platoons, for example. So I wouldn't necessarily say to aim for my V2 list in V3, but if you've only got one list that's built for V2, you can absolutely play V3 off the bat. Maybe just paint up a couple of more platoon commanders, kind of thing.
Yeah, the other thing I would recommend is additional artillery mortars. Those ones where if you are taking an artillery platoon, you might as well take a second one, because then you can always use those recrew rules that rarely get read. And again, we're sharing spotters.
Yeah.
If you're taking one more, you might as well take two.
Yeah.
And again, if you are the kind of player who's playing machine guns in V2, I'd take probably 3 machine guns now if you are so inclined to run machine guns, and they are finally like fairly decent. The fact that they're consistently hitting, like they're not, I would say machine guns aren't going to win you games. I did play a game with sort of 15 machine guns using the US rules to see how that went, and it was fun. They were competent, but because you still can't move, I'm still not sold on machine guns as being a great unit. But they're certainly no longer sort of a foolish unit to bring to a competitive scene.
Yeah, definitely. And, Germany getting the extra shot. German MGs putting out 7 shots is not to be sniffed at all. Both the games where I've played against my opponent running German armies, it's been like, that is a lot of shots for 50 points. They haven't changed in points. Autocannons are worth mentioning. Autocannons have come down in points, and they're 35 points for a light autocannon as a static artillery piece. It's a good price.
Oh yeah, it's really good, isn't it? And interestingly, on the other side of that, your howitzers have gotten longer range, and that's partly because one of the few things that ignores cover is the indirect HE, and so from a games mechanic that makes sense, because otherwise you'd be tempted just to take lots of them. But it does mean that actually perhaps that is another boost for your autocannon there.
Yeah.
So all that said, Phil, which army are you planning to play for V3? Have you got a specific build planned, or are you going to jump shift? Are you going to jump ship from one nation to another? What's on the painting table?
So I have been working on Tropical Fallschirmjäger for the last couple of months over the summer. So I'm going to definitely finish them off and use them as a German army. And I also built and primed a US Marine Force about a year ago, which is just sat built and primed for a year. So I think I'm going to go with Germany and US initially. Obviously, I'll still be using my Brits and my French and my Japanese, but it's an opportunity here with V3 to move into nations that I don't always play. I do have a US army, I do have a German army, but I didn't play them very often in V2. And I'm actually quite looking forward to the challenge in terms of the Fallschirmjäger. There's a lot of kit bashing going on there, and you don't often see Tropical Fallschirmjäger army, so quite looking forward to that. And the US Marines, I just love the AM tanks and the Buffalo. I think they look really cool. So again, quite looking forward to putting that together.
Yeah, absolutely. I love a Buffalo.
As we know. And what about you, Jonny?
I'm honestly not sure, to be honest. As I said earlier, I'm not excited to play Americans anymore, because I was really loving the thing that I really liked was how fast they were and sort of like moving up around the table, firing and maneuvering. It feels like they've lost a little bit of that magic now, and so I've lost a little bit of love for them. I think in the short term, because I've got so many American models, I will be playing Americans for the foreseeable. But I might be exploring new things. Obviously, I've got that Soviet army I just built for the Welsh Nationals sort of earlier in the year. So you could potentially be seeing that on the horizon, especially because I'm thinking the thing that I am excited about is sort of using armor now that you can basically do a tank platoon in a normal game. That's quite an exciting thing, not necessarily from a competitive perspective, but just having that opportunity to do lots of interesting tanks together. But I really haven't worked out exactly which way I'm going to go here yet. It's really fascinating because obviously all the things that I like have taken a big hit. So my Americans have taken a hit with the fire maneuver. My Dodgers have taken a hit with the easily destroyed. Their engineers have taken a big hit. I'm now paying an extra 15 points for engineers with a flamethrower. There's a lot of things. Basically, there's a lot of things against the way that I like to play the game, which means I think I probably am going to have to play the game differently in order to get the same sort of enjoyment out of it. And I don't really know what that looks like yet, to be honest.
And I think that's a really good point. I would encourage people to go into V3 with an open mind. This isn't V2.5. It's still bolt action. Bolt action still happens, that sort of thing. But it does feel like a different game. It doesn't just feel like a tidy up and a tweak. And I would really encourage people to go into it with an open mind and just go and play a load of games, try things out, find what works for you, because stuff that works in V2 does not work as effectively anymore, in V3. We talked about assaults, for example, that kind of stuff. It's an opportunity to try stuff out, see what happens, and just enjoy, it being a new game.
But equally, on the other side of the coin, I think because we had that conversation where you probably should play V3 with a V2 mindset, and don't come to it like that and judge the game on that basis. But actually, I would warn against the other way because I've found that it does still feel like bolt action. And so, like, yes, the nuances have changed, but actually, if you're down the club, it still feels like you're playing bolt action. It's not like you've suddenly jumped to a different game system entirely.
Yeah.
But I would say
yeah.
that V2 mindset actually probably is a little bit helpful because just because now you can take 4 of something doesn't mean you should necessarily.
Doesn't mean you should. That is a really good point.
And so I found myself doing, after having that conversation sort of off air between us of don't come to V3 with a V2 mindset, I've now gone full circle back to maybe I could do with a little bit of a V2 mindset when I'm thinking about running, I don't know, 4 25-pounders. Do I actually need 4 25-pounders?
Yeah, that is a really good point. There's definitely an element of just because you can doesn't mean you should. Yeah, but equally, just because you can't, you can't only take one now. Don't get too upset. Just find what works for you.
Yeah, and actually, in a lot of cases, you kind of can take just one of, because you can sort of take. So for the vehicles, we had this conversation where actually your tank and your armored car. That's one of each, the same as the generic platoon.
Yeah.
And actually, your artillery platoon, I believe, is just a single gun and an officer as your minimum requirement. So you can do that if you want.
Yeah, you can, yeah.
Whether you should, probably not. It is a bit of a shame, actually, talking about theatre rules that gotten drafted in. One of the really nice rules in a theatre book that I'm a bit good hasn't made it in is the artillery officers, where his men could recrew the guns. That would have been a really cool rule to add. So I'm hoping we see that in some way down the line, because that's a really nice little addition.
Yeah, certain nations had them, didn't they, from certain campaign books? So it may well be that when we get to that Armies of book for that particular nation that they appear then. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I think overall I'd say V2 is, for me, having played V2 at the weekend after having played V3. I have to say that it did make me appreciate a lot of the changes that have come up in V3. There's a few things that haven't quite been addressed. Like one of the things we talked about was ambushes. If you're retaining ambushes at the end of a turn, it would be nice to have a clarifying statement of who decides first. My proposal at the minute is to do dice in the bag the same way that forward deployers are done now. I think that would be a nice way to do it. But generally, I'd say the changes are good, and I think most people will enjoy playing it. Yeah. I think you'll have a small section who love it. So let's say like you'll have a big section who just like it, like it's a nice update. You'll have a very small section again at the bottom who aren't that big a fan. And I think the amount of people who really dislike it will be very small because I can't see huge things to dislike in it, really.
Yeah, I think overall it is better. If you put me on the spot, do I like it more? I do like it more as just as core mechanics, core rules, how it plays out. I like it more. Obviously, because it is the start of a new edition, and the unit choice is not as wide as it was, in V2 at the end. It's going to take time for that to develop. I'm fine with that. I'm quite happy with what's in the main rulebook. I'm quite happy with, the release schedule every 3 months, etc. I've just built 16 mounted Japanese cavalry, and the Manchukuo cavalry are not in the main rulebook, so they're going to sit on the shelf, until Armies of Japan comes out for V3. I don't mind that. Because I'll crack on with something else in the meantime.
Well, the funny thing is, there's some people who are saying they're not really looking forward to the next year or so while everything sort of is in turmoil, for want of a better word. So if it's a bit rocky where people are trying out different things and different things become the new hotness for a month and then... But actually, that's my favourite period of the game because you turn up to tournaments and you have no idea what you're going to face. Whereas tail end of a system, you can predict 60% of the list with quite a high certainty. For the next year to maybe it's even 2 years... You're going to be turned up to tournaments and you might face 4 Shermans one list and then the next list might be, I don't know, all inexperienced squads. And it's going to be really wild, the variety over the next 12 months. And I'm really looking forward to turning up to the table and nearly always having a different game.
Yeah, Russell was on Bo's channel recently talking about World Open War, and he was talking about he's looking forward to seeing what people bring, because it's happening 4 weeks after V3 is released. Same with the English Open. I'm really looking forward to what happens then. It's 6 weeks after the release date. We just don't know what people are going to bring. It is going to be really exciting. Beachhead's going to be the same for us. We'll be going there in February next year with Mike Smith. This is a really interesting time, I would say, definitely.
Yeah, and nothing's really gotten more expensive, but I think we can expect to see higher points limits. And so, again, that's going to open more doors as well, I think.
Yeah, I've kind of intimated that, haven't I, during the pod? I've been playing at 1250 and 1100 points, and I haven't played a game at 1,000 points, but I've obviously been writing different lists. I'm really struggling to get something that I feel works without min-maxing and so on at 1,000 points. 1250 is great. The game is quicker. So even with more dice, it actually doesn't take longer, and that's with an opponent who's maybe played one game or has played no games before, and I'm having to tell them the rules whilst I'm also only 2 or 3 games in myself. So yeah, I like the whole sort of 1250, 1100, 1200, 1250 kind of points. It gives you a little bit more opportunity to lean into the platoon structures and the new way of building your force and the force composition rules.
Absolutely, especially now that armor you can have quite a bit of armor.
Yeah.
One of the big complaints was always we don't see many tanks, and so if we do start to play 1200, approximately give or take 100, I think we're going to start to see more and more medium vehicles, just because it's not as big a hit to take them now compared to when about 1,000 was the common point. Yeah. I mean, I think there is still a place for 1,000 points though, because I do quite like that squeeze and having to make compromises in your list and playing around your weakness. But I think it's going to be a bit like when you do the tournaments where there's a 750 and a 1,000. It's basically the 900 to 1,000, and the 1,200 is the new 750, 1,000.
Yeah, that makes sense.
As ever, thank you for listening. If you are listening to this driving to the Warlords Open Day, please do come and say hello.
If you are in the UK and you want to experience a 2-day V3 event, we are running the English Open this year at Warfare, which is on November the 16th and 17th in Farnborough. If you head over to our Facebook page, there'll be details there, or head over to the Warfare website, there'll be details there. Also, if you are thinking about expanding your armies, do please consider using one of our affiliate links, which you'll find in the description.
Yeah, I do believe we're going to be the first, and insert a lot of qualifiers here, the first UK 2-day V3 tournament, I believe, unless I've missed one.
I believe we are, and the caveat being because we're treating World Open War as an international event rather than a UK tournament, because
Indeed.
they are before us.
Indeed. But we're giving them a shout out now, so they can't complain about us trying to steal their crown.
Yeah.
So, ta-ta for now.
Ta-ta for now.